I don't know about you, but I've always had such a big fear around being stuck in a cave. Obviously, it's never gonna actually happen to me because I'm not a spelunker, but that fear is still really deep inside my psyche. The thought of being stuck in a cave where you can't move at all is so horrifying, and it's really sad because this actually happened to some people, and we're gonna learn about those real cases. If you want more videos like this, be sure to subscribe, please, and I have an Instagram if you want to follow that, and a Discord if you want to join and hang out and talk. I'm in VC a lot, so, you know, hang out. But let's get into these cave exploration accidents. Also, before we get into this, I just wanted to give a shout out to Thebs on Spotify for giving me this idea for this video. Thank you so much for this idea, bro. This is a great idea, and here it is. So if you have an idea that you would want me to make, either put it in the comments on Spotify or YouTube, or DM me on Instagram or Discord, because I do run out of ideas sometimes, guys, so I need your help. Nutty Putty Cave, Utah, USA. Nutty Putty Cave is a small, muddy, hydrothermal cave in the West Desert of Utah, known for its very tight squeeze passages and for having caused multiple non-fatal stuck in the hole incidents before 2009. Because of that history, it had been gated and access controlled by permit even before the trip that we're gonna talk about today. On the night of November 24th, 2009, 26-year-old medical student and father of one, John Edward Jones, went caving there with his brother Josh and a group of friends and relatives as a pre-Thanksgiving outing. They entered around 8 p.m., went through a large sloping chamber called the Big Slide, and then John, Josh, and two others split off to look for one of the cave's challenge features, a notoriously tight passage nicknamed the Birth Canal. Oh my god, if there is a passage named the Birth Canal, there is no way I'm going anywhere near it, bro. The Birth Canal is a known squeeze that's narrow but passable and opens up at the end, so they were hunting for it by checking different small openings. John chose a waist-high hole near an area cavers call Ed's Push, believing that it led to the Birth Canal. In reality, it appears to have been an uncharted fissure. Inside, the rock narrowed into an L-shaped chute just 10 by 18 inches across, slanting downward at a steep angle. To keep progressing, he had to exhale, compress his chest, and slide deeper head first. At some point, he realized this wasn't the Birth Canal, but by then he was too far in to easily reverse. When he tried to back out and to bend his hips to turn around, his chest and back locked against the rock. As his lungs refilled with air, his ribcage expanded into the constriction and he became completely wedged upside down, about 400 feet from the entrance and roughly 100 or 125 feet below the surface. Josh reached his feet and tried to pull him out, but he could only budge him slightly. Every attempt to yank him free just let gravity pull him deeper when Josh lost his grip. Realizing it was beyond what they could do alone, the group backed out and called 911. That kicked off a full rescue response involving over 100 to 130 personnel from multiple agencies, including the Utah County Sheriff's Office, cave rescue specialists, and volunteers, all converging on a cave that already had a reputation in the local caving community as a place where people got stuck. Reaching him was the first major problem. Rescuers had to crawl through tight, twisting passages, then get past him to set up anchors in a space that hardly fit one person. He was pinned nearly head down at about an 80-degree angle, with one arm trapped under him and the other forced behind his back, leaving almost no leverage to help himself. Over the first hours, they got him a rope to hold, attempted to chip away rock near his torso, and eventually managed to place an IV to get fluids, plus food and small amounts of water when he could tolerate it. At one point, he spoke via radio to his pregnant wife and to rescuers, but as time went on, his responses got weaker and less frequent. Because there was so little space to work around him, rescuers decided their best shot was a mechanical extraction system. A rope and pulley setup anchored to bolts drilled into the cave walls and ceiling, with a harness around John's legs and torso to haul him up the chute a few inches at a time while he tried to push with whatever strength he had left. After hours of drilling anchors and rigging, the system initially showed promise. They managed to raise him several inches, hours, enough that his position improved slightly and some rescuers thought they were finally getting him out. But then the anchor system failed under load. Accounts differ on whether hardware or rock gave way, but one of the main rigging points broke, and the tension on the rope system suddenly released. John dropped back down into the fissure, reportedly ending up even more tightly wedged than before and suffering additional injury in the process. After that, the geometry was even worse. Less room around his chest, more difficulty getting tools and rescuers into position, and a more exhausted, traumatized patient who had already been inverted for many hours. Some teams tried again with modified rigging and chipping more rock, but every option carried a high risk of further collapse or of crushing him while trying to free him. Medically, his position was catastrophic. In an almost upside down posture for over 24 hours, blood was constantly pooling in his head and chest, while abdominal organs and the harness pressure restricted his diaphragm and lungs. That combination made it harder and harder for him to take breaths. It lowered his effective oxygenation, and it put a huge strain on his heart and brain. Even the rescuers kept talking to him, giving him fluids, monitoring his condition as best they could in that environment. His vital signs deteriorated. Late on November 25th, 2009, about 27 hours after he first got trapped, he went unresponsive and was pronounced dead, with rescuers and later officials attributing it to the cumulative effect of his position being inverted and compressed and how that was on his breathing and circulation. Once he died, the focus shifted to whether his body could be recovered safely. To reach him, rescuers would have had to keep working in the same unstable, cramped zone where the pulley anchor had already failed, and dismantle or enlarge the passage essentially around his body. After analysis, the Utah County Sheriff's Office and technical experts concluded that further attempts would put additional rescuers at serious risk with no guarantee of success. His family eventually agreed with the decision to leave him where he was rather than endanger more lives. The landowner and state officials then decided Nutty Putty Cave would be permanently closed. Engineers collapsed rock in the passage near where he lay and filled the main entrance with concrete, sealing the system and effectively making it his tomb. Some cavers protested the closure and tried to organize efforts to reopen it, but they all failed. Everyone pretty much agreed that the risk and the human cost were too high to justify keeping such a trap-prone cave in public use. Today, the hill where the entrance once was is informally known as John Jones Hill, marked by a plaque with his name and face, and the cave is off limits. Floyd Collins, Sand Cave, Kentucky. William Floyd Collins grew up next to Kentucky cave country and basically treated the landscape like his playground. By the 1910s to 1920s, the area around what's now Mammoth Cave National Park was kind of a war zone. Families were competing to find and commercialize show caves along the main roads, so tourists would pay their admission instead of the neighbors. Collins had already discovered and opened Great Crystal Cave on his family's land, but it sat too far off the main route and never made much money. So he worked out a deal with a neighbor, Beasley Doyle, to explore a small opening right on Cave City Road. If it turned into a decent show cave, they would split the profits. That is the hole that would become infamous as Sand Cave. On January 30th, 1925, Collins went into Sand Cave with just a kerosene lantern. Inside, the cave quickly narrowed. At one point, he had to slither on his stomach with one arm stretched out, pushing the lantern ahead and the other pinned at his side, then drop down into a lower passage and keep worming through. Beyond that nasty crawl, he reported a larger passage, but as he was heading back out, his lamp began to flicker. He turned around and started backing through the tightest section to avoid being in total darkness. During that retreat, his foot knocked loose a roughly 27-pound rock that rolled and pinned his ankle. When he tried to yank himself free, the surrounding rubble slumped and buried him up to the waist. By the time he stopped moving, he was basically wedged in a rock funnel about 55 to 60 feet underground, head and torso twisted in a narrow chute, with his lower leg trapped and very little room to dig around himself. When he didn't come home that night, neighbors went looking the next morning. They found his coat at the entrance and eventually sent a skinny 17-year-old, Jewel Estes, into the tight passage. Estes was the first person to crawl far enough back to make voice contact and confirm that Collins was alive but trapped. Soon, Floyd's brothers Homer and Marshall were on scene. At first, rescue was just family and locals trying to pass him food and water and dig the rock out by hand in a space that barely allowed one person at a time. Over the next couple of days, more organized attempts started. A Louisville rescue officer, Lieutenant Robert Burden, tried to pull Collins out with a chest harness and rope, but that only dragged Floyd's upper body painfully against the rock ceiling without freeing the leg and had to be abandoned. Rescuers ran an electrical cord down and hung light bulbs so he would at least have light and a bit of warmth. At the same time, all the people coming and going in the passage, plus outside campfires melting surface ice, made the cave less stable and increased dripping water, and Collins was lying in a cold puddle with barely any insulation. By February 4th, a collapse in the passage between him and the entrance sealed off the route rescuers had been using, leaving him alone behind a wall of rock while they argued over what to do next. Once the story leaked beyond Cave City, it blew up. Newspapers from across the country sent reporters, and radio operators relayed live updates from the hill above Sand Cave. The most famous journalist there was William Skeets Miller, a small-framed reporter from the Louisville Courier-Journal. He physically crawled into the cave multiple times to interview Collins face-to-face, then came back out and filed dispatches that ran nationwide. For those trips, he ended up working as a rescuer as much as a reporter, passing food, checking Floyd's condition, and helping with the jacking attempts around the rock. His coverage later earned him a Pulitzer Prize and turned this one entrapment into a national spectacle. Above ground, the rescue site mutated into something people later described as a carnival. As the days went on, thousands of sightseers showed up. Vendors set up tents selling hot coffee, food, and souvenirs. By early February, the state National Guard had to come in just to control the crowds. On Sunday, February 8th, estimates put around 10,000 people on the hillside, so many that locals nicknamed it Carnival Sunday. Around 4,500 cars clogged the country roads with license plates from 20 states. Reporters and even motion picture crews swarmed the area. One British correspondent used the event to make the first transatlantic phone call from Cave City. Rumors started flying that the whole thing was a hoax to sell tickets to Collins's earlier cave, that the rescuers weren't trying hard enough, or that he was already dead and someone was covering it up. A court of inquiry was actually convened nearby to try to tamp down conspiracy theories while the rescue was still in progress. After the cave passage collapsed, the only realistic option left was to dig a shaft from the surface. Under Kentucky National Guard command and supervision from mining engineer Henry Carmichael, workers started a 6x6 foot vertical shaft down through rock and mud to intersect the cave next to Collins. They weren't allowed to use dynamite or heavy machinery for fear of triggering more collapses, so everything was done with picks, shovels, and buckets. Progress was pretty slow. It was roughly 1 foot per hour at best, often worse when they hit big boulders or had to shore up the walls. At the peak, around 75 men worked in relays, with the Red Cross feeding them and a field hospital treating exhaustion, injuries, and hypothermia. It took 17 days from the original entrapment for the shaft and lateral tunnel to finally reach the Sand Cave Passage. On February 16th, 1925, a miner named Ed Brenner broke through and found Collins's body. His leg was still wedged under the rock. He had been dead long enough that rescuers and doctors estimated he'd likely died on February 13th from exposure, starvation, and overall collapse. Because his body was tightly pinned and the shaft itself was starting to slump and become dangerous, authorities made the call to leave him in place and backfill the new shaft. For a while, Sand Cave was literally his grave. 2 months later, though, his brother Homer and some friends quietly reopened the shaft, dug a side tunnel to the opposite side of the passage, and managed to free the remains. The body was embalmed at a funeral home in Cave City and first buried on a hill above Great Crystal Cave, which the family rebranded using Floyd's name. When the Collins property was sold a few years later, the new owner moved the body into the cave and displayed it in a glass-topped coffin as a roadside attraction. In 1929, the body was stolen, later found in a field missing the left leg, and from then on it was kept in a chained casket deeper in the cave instead of an open display. I would prefer that. I feel like having someone's body, like dead remains, as a tourist attraction is really fucked up. I mean, is that just me? In the 1960s, the federal government bought Crystal Cave as part of the expansion of Mammoth Cave National Park. The Collins family had always hated the fact that tourists were staring at Floyd's corpse underground. In 1989, the National Park Service finally honored their wishes and moved his remains to a normal grave at Mammoth Cave Baptist Church Cemetery. Over time, the whole incident came to be a really just infamous disaster in US history. I guess for older people, because I had never heard of this until I researched this video. But this is so sad. Let's move on to the next one. What do you guys think about this one? Pluragrata, Norway. Plura Cave, or Pluragrata, is a flooded cave system in Rana, northern Norway. It's very cold, around 2 to 7 degrees Celsius. It's pretty deep, down to about 135 meters, and has long, narrow passages connecting the Plura River entrance to a dry cave called Steinuglefloget. In 2013, Finnish divers confirmed the full underwater connection between these two entrances, and that traverse became a very serious, big objective dive. It's about 3 kilometers underwater with a max depth of 130 meters and many hours of decompression. In early February 2014, 5 experienced Finnish cave divers went to Plura to do that full traverse from the Plura entrance to the dry cave. I'm not gonna try to pronounce that again. The plan on February 6th was to do a 5-hour dive to around 129 to 130 meters, split into 2 teams. So one pair went first, and then a team of 3 would follow 3 hours later. All of them were on closed-circuit rebreathers with multiple bailout cylinders, DPVs, which are scooters, and proper cold water dry suits. This was a very serious expedition. This wasn't any kind of casual tourist dive. According to the survivors' official accident statement, the first pair reached the planned deep section at about 129 meters. On the way back out, one diver's equipment became wedged in the rock around 110 meters below the surface. His teammate tried to free him, but couldn't in the confined space, and the trapped diver unfortunately drowned there. The second team, still on schedule and unaware of what had happened, entered the cave 2 hours after the first. When they reached depth, they found their friend's body and also tried to free him unsuccessfully. While that was happening, another diver in the trio started having technical problems with his breathing setup and switched to backup gas. Despite help from the third diver, he also died. The 3 surviving divers aborted, made a long, slow return with required decompression stops, and then surfaced and called for help. They had been in the water nearly 8 hours, and all 3 were airlifted to Tromsø and treated for decompression sickness. Norwegian authorities quickly decided that they wanted to recover the bodies if possible. Because of the depth and the complexity, they called in an international team of elite cave divers, including well-known British divers Richard Stanton and John Volanthen, to assess the route. After reconnaissance dives, the team judged a body recovery at 110 to 130 meters in those tight sections too dangerous. Norwegian police then stopped further diving, and they put an official ban on entering Plura. For weeks, the 2 dead divers remained in the cave. Norwegian police signaled that they would not risk more lives to bring them up. For the surviving Finnish divers and the Finnish cave diving community, that was unacceptable, both for the family's sake and because they feared the cave might stay permanently closed if 2 bodies remained inside. So they planned their own recovery. In late March 2014, a group of about 17 Finnish divers and surface support quietly returned. The cave was still officially closed and they didn't have permission, but there was no one physically stopping them. Over 5 days, from the 22nd to the 26th of March, they carried out a carefully planned, step-by-step operation. They dived back into the deep section, moving the bodies from the original 110 to 130 meter zone into a shallower, drier part of the cave system, where Norwegian police divers could access them more safely. Every work dive was filmed with helmet cameras, and all video and recovered equipment was later handed over to the police as evidence. After the Finnish team repositioned the bodies, Norwegian authorities went back in and completed the final retrieval from the dry section. One body was brought out on March 27th, and the second the following day. YLE, which is Finnish Public Broadcasting, reported that the whole unauthorized mission was explicitly organized, quote, to get home the 2 divers who lost their lives. The operation was pretty controversial because it openly, defied the Norwegian ban, but the divers were widely respected in the community for taking on the risk to do what they did. Their story and the recovery dives were actually turned into a documentary called Diving into the Unknown, which uses the real helmet cam footage and some interviews. Eventually, Norwegian authorities lifted the Plura diving ban on the 31st of March in 2014. It's open today, but it has a pretty scary reputation. Tham Luang Cave Rescue, Chiang Rai, Thailand. Tham Luang Nang Nan is a long, winding cave system under a mountain on the Thai-Myanmar border. It runs about 10 kilometers with narrow choke points, dead ends, and sections that routinely flood in rainy seasons. There's literally a warning sign at the entrance telling people not to go in during the monsoon months. On June 23rd, 2018, after football practice, 12 boys from the Wild Boars youth team, aged 11 to 16, and their 25-year-old assistant coach, Ekafon, went into the cave for what was supposed to be a quick adventure. While they were inside, heavy early monsoon rain hit. Water rushed into the lower tunnels, blocking the way back out. Their only option was to keep moving deeper and look for higher ground. Eventually, they ended up on a small mud ledge about 4 kilometers from the entrance and hundreds of meters below the surface. That night, the parents realized the boys were missing. The head coach went to the cave, found their bikes and bags still outside, and raised the alarm. Local rescue teams and Thai Navy SEALs moved in, but the cave was already turning into a washing machine pretty much. Strong currents, zero visibility, and tight flooded sections where even experienced divers were basically swimming blind, one hand on the guideline. Pumps and improvised dams were thrown in to try and slow the water. Teams also searched the mountain above for any shaft that might drop into the passages below, but there was no easy entrance hiding up there. Within a few days, the whole thing turned into an international operation. British cave divers John Volanthen and Richard Stanton were brought in, along with teams from Australia, the US, China, and others. Their job was just to find the kids, lay guideline, retreat when the water surged, and then push again when levels dropped. It took 9 full days. On July 2nd, Volanthen and Stanton finally surfaced into an air pocket beyond a chamber nicknamed Pattaya Beach and saw the boys and coach sitting on a ledge, alive but exhausted and thin. The helmet cam video where the diver asks, "How many of you?" and they answer, 13, is from that moment.
How many of you? 13.
That ledge was about 4 kilometers in and roughly 800 to 1,000 meters below the mountaintop. But finding them only solved half the nightmare. The route back to the entrance involved multiple flooded constrictions. In some places, passages only about 38 centimeters wide, with fast current and horrible visibility. Even for elite cave divers, it was a 6-hour trip in, 5-hour trip out. Just teaching the boys to dive and swim them out like a normal scuba class wasn't realistic here. Meanwhile, oxygen inside their chamber was dropping. Measurements showed about 15% oxygen when normal breathable air is about 20 to 23%. If you leave them there too long, they would just start to deteriorate from the air. So the rescuers had about 3 broad options. Wait months until the rainy season was over and the water levels dropped, drill down from the surface, or pull off a full underwater extraction. Thai authorities, with help from foreign advisors, eventually concluded that drilling was too slow and uncertain in that rock, and camping underground until October would probably kill them via hypoxia or infection. That left the insane option: sedate the boys and bring them out underwater, one by one, escorted by cave divers. Australian cave diver slash anesthesiast Richard Harris was specifically requested to help design the medical side of that plan. To make extraction even possible, they first had to turn the cave into a supply line. Teams set up a staging base in Chamber 3 and stocked the route with hundreds of cylinders so divers would always have bailout gas and the kids could be moved through in stages. It meant swimming cylinders deep into the cave over and over in near zero visibility water. On the night of July 5 to 6, former Thai Navy SEAL Samin Kunin, who had returned as a volunteer, was part of a team moving air tanks along the submerged sections near the T-junction closer to the boys. On his way back from one of these drops, he ran out of visible air and lost consciousness underwater. His dive partner tried to resuscitate him in the cave and again back at Chamber 3, but he couldn't be revived. Official reports list suffocation or asphyxiation as the cause of death. His death didn't stop the operation, but it made a lot of people kind of take a second and think about it. Like, if a former SEAL with that much experience could die on this supply run, this was definitely way more and way beyond a normal rescue. So the final plan was pretty much this. techniques. First, dress each child in a wetsuit, buoyancy aid, harness, and full-face positive pressure mask. Secondly, sedate them so they stayed unconscious but they were breathing on their own. Thirdly, clip an oxygen-rich cylinder to their front, attach handles and a tether, and treat them like packages that a lead diver could push and pull through the cave. And fourthly, have support divers at air chambers to check vitals, give top-up doses of ketamine, and swap cylinders as needed. Dr. Harris used ketamine as the main anesthetic, with additional drugs, and trained a small group of cave divers to give repeat injections underwater, because the trip would be several hours and the initial dose only lasted around 45 to 60 minutes. This kind of thing is the opposite of normal anesthetic practice. Like later on, the medical papers straight up describe it as unprecedented and extremely risky. On July 8th, with more heavy rain forecast, they started the extraction. 13 international cave divers and 5 Thai Navy SEALs formed the backbone of this in-cave rescue team. Each boy was paired with a lead diver. The diver would keep his own head above the boys, so if they hit rock in a tight spot, it was the rescuer's helmet, not the kid's mask, that made contact. In the water, they watched for exhaust bubbles to confirm the boy was still breathing. The route was broken into segments. After the first long submerged stretch, they reached a dry chamber where support divers stripped off gear, slid the boy on a drag stretcher over rocks and mud, and then re-kitted him for the next flooded section. At chamber 3, the cave diver phase ended. There, a line of rescuers, soldiers, police, volunteers, turned each boy into a stretcher-bound relay, carrying and sliding them across a path of ropes and pulleys all the way to the entrance. Because of days of pumping and digging, that final leg had gone from a 4 to 5 hour slog at the beginning of the operation to under an hour by the time rescue started. The first day, 4 boys came out. The second day, 4 more. On July 10th, the last 4 boys and the coach were evacuated. As that final phase wrapped up, pumps in chamber 3 suddenly failed and the water began rising fast. One diver later said that it was about half a meter every 10 minutes. It's a lot. Around 100 rescuers still inside had to sprint for the entrance, abandoning their gear. They all made it out, but if the pump failure had happened just any earlier, it could have cut the team off again. In total, the operation ran 18 days from the day that they went in on June 23rd to the last extraction, which is July 10th. It involved roughly 10,000 people, more than 100 divers, 700 plus cylinders, 10 helicopters, and over 1 billion liters of water pumped out of that cave. All 13 members of the wild boars survived. 2 rescuers, though, didn't. Saman Kunin in July 2018, and Thai Navy SEAL Baru Pakabara, who died in December 2019 from a blood infection believed to have been contracted during the mission. Neil Moss, Peak Cavern, Derbyshire, England. Oscar Hackett Neil Moss was a 20-year-old philosophy student at Balliol College, Oxford, and a keen amateur caver with the British Speleological Association. On Sunday 22nd, March 1959, he was part of an 8-person party exploring through the tourist section of Peak Cavern in Castleton, Derbyshire. They'd already traveled roughly 1,000 feet from daylight into a large chamber, then known as Stalagmite Chamber, later renamed Moss Chamber. At the far end of that chamber, they found a narrow, unexplored shaft dropping about 40 feet. It was only around 2.5 by 1.5 feet across, just big enough for a slim person, and a rope ladder was rigged down it. Moss went first. According to his companions, he had only gone part way when his voice came back up, saying, "I'm stuck. I can't budge an inch." Quote unquote. The working theory from his party and later reports is that as he descended, he dislodged a boulder or a constriction in the shaft. That rock shifted and pinned or jammed the rope ladder against the wall. When the people above him tried to haul him back up, the ladder couldn't move freely. The rungs were spaced about a foot apart, and in the cramped shaft, Moss couldn't get enough reach or leverage to climb back up through the remaining gap. Initial rescue attempts were improvised. His group tried to pull him out with the ropes, but they were working at an awkward angle from the chamber above, and the rope snapped more than once under the strain. Moss, wedged in the shaft with his weight downwards, couldn't contribute much upward force himself. Meanwhile, the air at the bottom of the shaft was getting worse. His carbide lamp and his own breathing were steadily dumping carbon dioxide into a narrow, dead-end pocket with almost no ventilation. Over time, that foul air built up enough that he began to suffer hypercapnia, which is too much much CO2 in the lungs and blood, leading to confusion and periods of unconsciousness. Realizing they were out of their depth, Moss's party backed out and raised the alarm. Over the next hours and days, a large multi-agency rescue effort formed. Local cavers and mountain rescue, the RAF, National Coal Board mining experts, Royal Navy personnel, and doctors all came in to help. Oxygen cylinders and a rubber tube were brought down to try to blow fresher air into the shaft, but measurements and reports from those on scene suggest that this really did little to overcome the CO2 collecting in that confined space around them. As the situation dragged into a second day, the rescue became more organized but also more desperate. Because the shaft was so tight, rescuers needed someone small and experienced enough to get down to Moss and work around him. In response to appeals, 18-year-old caver June Bailey volunteered. She spent about 6 hours in the shaft over repeated trips, trying to clear rocks, adjust ropes, and assist with hauling attempts, before being forced back by the increasingly toxic air. Veteran caver Bob Leakey also answered the call after hearing about the incident on BBC radio, but he too was unable to reach Moss safely. When direct extraction up the shaft kept failing, rescuers tried a different plan, drilling through the rock to reach him from the side or below. That meant bringing in heavy equipment into a confined underground chamber and working close enough that vibrations and dust were additional hazards. A doctor on scene, Hugh Kidd, monitored Moss's condition as best he could by listening for breathing at pauses in the drilling. He recognized a Shane Stokes breathing pattern, which apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently that's irregular gasps with long pauses pretty much, and it is a sign of a failing respiratory system in a poisoned environment. Eventually, during one of those pauses in the drilling, he could no longer hear any breathing at all, and pronounced Moss dead in the early hours of March 24th, 1959, without ever being able to see the body directly. At the cave entrance, Moss's father had been keeping vigil. Once it was clear his son had died, he made a specific request, that the body be left where it was rather than risk more lives trying to haul it out through a shaft that had already nearly killed several rescuers. That decision effectively ended the physical rescue. Fellow cavers sealed the fissure at the bottom of the chamber with loose rock from the cave floor. Someone carved 1959 Neil N-I-E-L Moss R.I.P. with his first name misspelled into a nearby rock. The chamber, previously called Great Cascade Chamber or Stalagmite Chamber, was formally renamed Moss Chamber in his memory, like I mentioned earlier. Contrary to some newspaper stories at the time, the shaft itself wasn't filled with concrete. Participants later confirmed that it was just blocked with rock. This story really got huge coverage all over the world in British, European, Australian, and American newspapers. Time magazine ran a piece called "The Man in the Shaft." Public reaction included calls to restrict or even ban caving, and there were accusations in the press about whether anyone had made mistakes, but the coroner's inquest returned a verdict of death by misadventure and found no fault with either Moss's friends and companions or any of the rescuers. In later summaries of UK caving fatalities, his case is singled out as the only one in which a caver died purely because they became stuck and succumbed to asphyxia from foul air in a confined space. Over the decades, the incident had stayed in the culture of British caving and beyond. It's in a lot of fiction, and it's in some non-fiction books. It's been covered a lot in British culture, so any British fans out there, I'm sorry if you've heard this one a million times, but I thought it was worth including. High Atlas Mountains, Morocco. In March to April 2015, a group of 9 experienced Spanish cavers from the Andalusian mountaineering / speleology community were exploring a remote area of the High Atlas Mountains between Marrakesh and Ouarzazate. 3 of them broke off from the main group to take on a more technical objective, that being the Awandris Canyon, a deep, narrow gorge with 300 to 800 meter walls, snow on the approaches, and no easy exit routes once you're committed. The 3 men were Gustavo Vivares, a 41-year-old lawyer and an experienced caver, Jose Antonio Martinez, 41, a national police chief inspector from Almeria, and Juan Bolivar, a 27-year-old police officer from Granada. The larger group had an agreed meetup. Everyone was supposed to regroup in Ouarzazate on Tuesday. When the trio didn't show up, their colleagues waited a short time and then raised the alarm alarm on Wednesday, contacting the Spanish embassy and the Moroccan Royal Gendarmerie and starting their own search. By Thursday evening, after crossing snow-covered ground, the 6 searchers finally spotted their missing friends at the bottom of a deep canyon in the Tarmest/Tamest area. From the rim, they could see 2 men at the base, one moving forward, who was Bolivar, and one signaling from inside a sleeping bag, that was Martinez. They also noticed something hanging 40 to 50 meters up on a rope. At first they thought it was a backpack, but it turned out to be víveres suspended in midair. Later accounts from the surviving cavers suggest that this was probably what happened. Basically, while the 3 were climbing up to bypass a waterfall, an anchor or a bolt failed on icy rock. One man slipped, dragging the other 2 with him. 2 of them, víveres and Martinez, ended up hanging on a rope partway up the wall, while Bolivar reached or fell to the canyon floor. Víveres remained suspended for at least 2 days before his body eventually dropped to the bottom. Martinez survived the initial fall but suffered major injuries, broken legs and a head injury, according to his wife, and was effectively immobilized at the base of the ravine. And I gotta point out that any rescue would have to be done by rope in multiple stages under heavy exposure because where they were had sheer walls, snow and ice on the approaches, and like no place for a helicopter to land. When the SIG's colleagues realized where the trio was, they stayed the night at the rim and expected Moroccan rescue teams to arrive quickly. By 10 a.m. the next morning, with nobody on scene, they tried to improvise their own descent, but they only had a 50-meter rope, nowhere near enough to reach the canyon floor safely. They had to give up and wait. Moroccan gendarmes and civil protection units eventually arrived and began rigging their own system. The Spanish cavers later reported that Moroccan teams even asked them for extra rope, which is really showing how improvised everything was. Meanwhile, official communication in Spain and Morocco stayed pretty optimistic. On Saturday, officials announced that all 3 men had been found alive at the bottom of a ravine several hundred meters deep in that region, though injured. But the reality on the ground shifted kinda quickly. Víveres was confirmed dead on Saturday, before rescuers could reach him. Martinez, badly injured, survived longer but died on Sunday while still awaiting evacuation. Bolivar was the only one who made it out alive. He was finally hoisted from the ravine on Sunday, stretchered out by Moroccan police and Spanish officials, and taken to the Shifa clinic in Ouarzate, where doctors described him as in good health but suffering from hypothermia and shock. As the bodies and the survivor were being brought out, the political side really blew up. Spain had offered early on to send a specialized Civil Guard mountain rescue unit by plane, but Morocco initially declined, saying the situation was under control. But according to the Spanish government and some reporting later on, authorization for the Spanish rescue team to deploy to the canyon wasn't granted until Sunday, after the first death had already been confirmed. So basically, there was some stuff that was not handled well during this, and it could have saved some lives, which is so sad. Really, really sad when governments are, too caught up in their own greed or pride or whatever it is that it ends in people losing their lives. Eagle's Nest Sink, Florida, USA. From the surface, Eagle's Nest looks like a murky little pond buried in the pines of the Chassahowiska Wildlife Management Area, near Weeki Wachee on Florida's Gulf Coast. Underneath that pond, though, is the problem. A vertical sink that drops into a huge chamber and then into a sprawling cave system that goes down to roughly 300 feet, with upstream and downstream tunnels branching off. Divers describe the entrance as swimming through green water until around 20 feet down, you hit a small tube in the rock. You squeeze through that, jump into a big void, the ballroom, quote unquote, and then the walls vanish into black. Your light just gets swallowed by darkness in every direction. Past that are long, silty passages with deep slopes, debris cones, and overhead rock the entire time. You're fully in an overhead environment with no direct ascent option. Because of the depth and layout, Eagle's Nest is only considered appropriate for full cave certified divers using trimix or helium blends and with plenty of deep cave experience on top of that. Recreational scuba certification doesn't even come close to what's needed here. Official recommendations from cave diving groups explicitly say minimum full cave and trimix and experience. The site has built up a reputation as one of the Mount Everest style objectives in cave diving. It's the same kind of thing to mountaineers as Mount Everest is. A Washington Post piece describes it as one of Florida's most treacherous underwater caves, with passages dropping to about 300 feet and extending roughly a mile. And then to stop untrained people from going in, there is now actually a famous Grim Reaper sign at the cave entrance. It says, "Stop. prevent your death. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for. Despite that sign though, accidents keep stacking up. There are two specific incidents that actually get brought up a lot. First is Christmas 2013 between a father and a son. On December 25th, 2013, 35-year-old Darren Spivey and his 15-year-old son Dylan Sanchez went out to try out new scuba gear at Eagle's Nest. Both sadly drowned. News reports and dive industry coverage say that Sanchez wasn't even a certified diver at all, and Spivey, while being open water certified, did not have any cave diving certification. It's so sad. And then October 2016, Patrick Peacock and Chris Rittenmeyer, who were both experienced cave divers, went in with a third diver, Justin Blakely. Blakely stayed shallower, and Peacock and Rittenmeyer headed deeper. When they missed the rendezvous, Blakely searched for hours before calling the authorities, and then recovery showed that both men had sadly died deep in the system. And that's the end of the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching this far. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know in the comments what you want to see next. Please consider subscribing or following on Spotify wherever you are. Thank you so much. Have a great night. Sweet dreams.